Dr. Cerf, it's a pleasure to meet you again. It's been quite some time. I think we first met in 2010 when you were speaking in Raleigh, North Carolina with Sir Tim Berners-Lee and talking about where the internet, how the internet came about, how the World Wide Web came about, and what is going to happen in the future, what you predicted was going to happen in the future.
So it's a pleasure to see you again, and of course now we have a chance to test whether any of our predictions 9 years ago came true, or whether we have to make more predictions.
I'm not going to take you to task over the predictions that you made in the past, but I will ask the question, what's coming up next?
Fair enough.
Because as I understand it, this whole idea of transferring ones and zeros back and forth between computers, it was a pretty good idea, it sounds like.
Seems to have helped us do a lot of things that we couldn't have done otherwise.
Now, I'm a technologist, and you're a technologist. You're at the pinnacle of technology. We were sitting here at Google headquarters. How did you explain this technology to a whole world of lay people, because no one understood what the internet was?
Well, but the good news is I didn't have to do that, at least not at the beginning. Remember, this was a Defense Department experiment. It started in 1968 or so. The network began operation in 1969. In fact, we're about to celebrate on the 29th of October the 50th anniversary of the connection of the first two nodes and computers on the ARPANET project, the predecessor to the internet, at SRI International in Menlo Park, California, and at UCLA in Los Angeles. So on the 29th of October, the machines on the network and the two packet switches that we call interface message processors, or IMPs, were interconnected for the first time. So it didn't require selling anything, because the Defense Department wanted to build this for purposes of resource sharing, because they had a dozen universities that were doing research in artificial intelligence. And they concluded that the right thing to do was to link all of the computers that were being used in this research together, so that the researchers could share their results and share each other's resources instead of having to buy new computers for everybody every year. So we built the ARPANET for that purpose. Once the ARPANET was successful, it became clear that this packet switching idea had some real legs. We had, around 1973 or so, Bob Kahn, who had worked on the ARPANET project for a company called Bolt, Beranek and Newman, came to my office at Stanford, where I was just beginning to do some additional research in networking after having had the ARPANET experience at UCLA. And his idea was, how about using computers in command and control? Use the algorithms on the machines to manage the resources of the Defense Department more effectively than an opponent. But in order to do that, the computers had to be available in mobile vehicles, ships at sea, and airplanes. And up to that point, all we had done is hook computers together that were in fixed locations in air-conditioned rooms with dedicated telephone circuits. So Bob arrived saying that we needed satellite networks to do ship-to-ship and ship-to-shore. We needed mobile radio networks for airborne and for mobile ground operation. And he had already started working on and thinking his way through these additional networks. So that was the internet problem. So I didn't have to explain that to the cohort that did the original ARPA network or did the internet work. The place where we had to make some serious, do some serious persuasion came with the arrival of non-military participants. So the Department of Energy, which was using computers for a lot of its work, NASA, which was using computers, and the National Science Foundation, all civilian agencies, had to be persuaded that this technology that had been developed by the Defense Department initially for a command and control system would be useful for their purposes. And we were successful in convincing them of that. And again, it wasn't too hard because they were technologists. This wasn't the general public, it wasn't the commercial sector. Getting the commercial sector and the general public to understand why this was useful was a whole other matter. And that revolved around applications. It had nothing to do with the basic technology. Nobody cares how the basic technology works. What they care about is an application that works. And so getting the general public drawn into this was a matter of getting companies to understand there was a business to be had supplying internet service, a business to be had selling equipment that knew how to do internet, a business to be had creating applications that other people would buy. And so that process begins in the late 1980s, around 1989, in fact, 30 years ago. And that's when we started to see commercial internet services coming. There were companies like Cisco and Proteon and others that were making equipment to help people build networks. The Ethernet development at Xerox PARC and Sun Microsystems workstations, for example, and the development of Unix and outfitting it with TCP/IP, the Internet protocols, enabled a lot of academic acquisition of software, hardware, and service. And then the general public gets access to it starting in 1989. But the real trigger that caused the general public to discover this stuff was the arrival of the World Wide Web in December of 1991. Tim Berners-Lee announced the existence of his World Wide Web design, which layered right on top of the TCP/IP protocols of the Internet, and nobody noticed, except for a couple of guys at the network, what was it called, the National Center for Supercomputer Applications in Champaign-Urbana, Eric Bina and Mark Andreessen. They developed the Mosaic browser, which was a graphical user interface version of the browser, of Tim Berners-Lee's text-based browser. That allowed the internet to look like a magazine because there was formatted text and imagery and streaming audio and eventually streaming video. That grabbed a lot of attention. And the existence of the hypertext markup language and the web page concept enabled lots and lots of people to put information on the internet that they wanted to share with others. And so there was this avalanche of content that flowed in once the Mosaic browser showed up. And that was swiftly followed by commercial versions, for example, Netscape Navigator. And the Netscape company, which was started by Jim Clark, well, it was actually Jim Clark, who had built Silicon Graphics,
right.
also inaugurated Netscape Communications, and with Mark Andreessen and others who had come from NCSA. And so that triggered this gigantic explosion of content on the net. And after that, you didn't have to explain very much because people didn't really care how it worked. They only cared that you could find stuff on the net and make use of it. Then we run into the problem of it exploded in content, just endless websites being created, which caused us to have to invent search engines so you could find stuff in this giant ocean of information. Hence the arrival of things like Yahoo and Google and Bing eventually from Microsoft. There were predecessor systems like Alta Vista that in Palo Alto, where it was a text-based search engine. And it was in its day, it was one of the best search engines available, but it was overtaken by these others. So all of these things happen because they're forced on us out of need. And so coming back to your original question about how did you convince people to use this, we didn't have to really. Once the tools were available, once the content was discoverable, once people found the ease with which they could create and share content, this all took off like a rocket.
You're in I would consider a very rare echelon of people. You've reached the pinnacle of academia. You have a PhD from UCLA, multiple degrees as well as from Stanford. You've got 29 honorary doctorates, 30 medals from all sorts of places around the world. And you're also an engineer, that you've developed something that was extraordinarily, it's one of the few inventions that has revolutionized pretty much every industry in the world. And you're also Google's chief internet evangelist. You're an academic, you're an inventor, an engineer, and you're an evangelist. I'm not sure I can name anybody else that fits all three of those categories.
Oh, I suspect that you would find a bunch of them. Let me suggest you have a look at the Marconi Society webpage.
Okay.
Now, I confess I'm chairman of the board of the Marconi Society, so I'm biased, but if you look at the webpage, you will see quite a range of people who fall into those categories. They are inventors, they are entrepreneurs, they are humanitarians, and they have been recognized since 1974, this cohort. So I'm not unique in that regard.
Was there an advantage? Did you come about the communication skills naturally, or did you hone them over time? How did you get to the point where you can speak on behalf of one of the largest companies in the world with a mission to bring the rest of the world onto the internet?
Well, let's tease this apart a little bit. First of all, you should recognize that success in getting the internet off the ground had several components, one of which was technical, and certainly the work that Bob Kahn and I did in the earliest days, in the early 70s, plus my graduate students, and a whole bunch of other people, is what made the internet possible. The technical capability was powerfully developed. But the reason that so many people had their fingers in that pie was because I felt like I could sell them on doing what I needed to do. And so I think the important part of internet success has to do with selling your ideas and getting other people to want to do what you want to do. And that's what the essence of salesmanship is. It's convincing somebody that they want what you have, or you want to do what they want you to do, or they want to do what you want them to do. So we were pretty good at that, and I learned early on that I couldn't just be an engineer. I had to sell ideas. So when I talk to my engineers, I tell them that the first thing they have to learn is how to sell their ideas to other people so they can get help, because otherwise you won't do anything very big. Now, as an engineer, and I feel, even though my title is officially is a computer scientist, I feel like I'm an engineer because engineers solve problems. They love problems. Just give me a problem, that I can, gnaw on. So if the problem requires more people than you, then that's the next step is salesmanship. So I tell all my engineers, you got to learn how to sell your ideas. And that is part of what's I would attribute the success of the internet to that capacity. So that means that I've been selling for a very long time. Now, what does evangelism mean? Well, evangelism means convincing people that they should adopt the ideology that you have. And when people ask, what kind of an evangelist are you? I tell them I'm geek orthodox. and that's basically correct. And when you think about my role here at Google, when I joined the company, which is now 14 years ago, they asked me, Larry and Eric and Sergey, what title did I want? And I said Archduke, because I've always wanted that. I thought that was such a great title. Then they went away and came back and said, that's probably doesn't fit in our HR scheme. And then besides, they pointed out that the previous Archduke was Ferdinand, and he was assassinated in 1914, and it started World War I. They said, maybe that's a bad title to have. Why don't you be our chief internet evangelist? And I thought, okay, well, I can do that because I've been doing that for the last 30 years. So part of my job is getting more internet built all around the world because that's good for Google. And I'd like to say it's good for everybody to the degree that content on the internet is useful and facilitates people's advancement. So that's what I spent a lot of my time on, is policy that needs to be adopted in order to encourage investment in infrastructure that will support internet, or adoption of competitive policies that will encourage more entrepreneurship. Yes. And so I spent a lot of my time with government officials around the world trying to persuade them that they should adopt policies that have open internet, lots of opportunity for multiple entrepreneurs to offer their products and services, expenditure, even government expenditure on underlying infrastructure or subsidies or something to get the ball rolling. And so that's what I spent a lot of my time on, in addition to worrying about the technologies that Google adopts in order to offer its products and services.
What did you learn over the years about how to communicate with these foreign leaders about a technology that they may or may not be familiar with, or they may not have the same level? No one has the same level of background that you have, but connecting the dots in such a way that you would persuade them to work with you.
So I think I'm an educator, and one of the things that I value most is somehow getting the model I have in my head into somebody else's head, so that they can think about some complex system in relatively simple ways. So finding simple metaphors for people that will allow people to think about the internet, and reason about it, and come to the right conclusions, even if they don't have every single little detail right. These useful metaphors are very powerful. And so I've found, for example, that a good metaphor for the way the internet works is to think about postcards. Everything you know about a postcard applies to an internet packet. A postcard has a to address and a from address. It has some content. That's true of an internet packet. Postcards, if you put them into the post box expecting them to be picked up by the post office, are not always delivered. Sometimes they get delivered to the wrong place, and sometimes they get lost. Internet packets have a similar potential hazard. If you put two postcards into the post box destined for the same place, they don't necessarily come out in the same order you put them in. This is also true of internet packets. Now, the internet does something that the post office doesn't do. Sometimes you put a packet in and two of them come out because of retransmissions and alternate routing. That's not a service that the post office offers. But basically, all the things that you can think about are very similar between postcards and high-speed packets. Now, one would look at that and say, why would anybody want a system like that that gets things out of order, it loses things, and it duplicates stuff? And the answer is, well, to make that useful, you have to put another layer of protocol on top of the basic internet postcard protocol, and we call that transmission control protocol. And the best way to understand how that works is to imagine if you had a book that you wanted to send a friend through a postal service that only handles postcards, what would you do? Well, first of all, you'd have to cut the pages out of the book, probably have to cut them up to get them to fit on a postcard. And the first thing you'd notice is that not every postcard has a page number because you cut it up, but they could get out of order, so you have to number them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then you know that they might get lost, so you have to keep copies in case you have to resend them. And then you wonder, how do you know when you should resend them? And then you get this brilliant idea, okay, the recipient could send you a postcard saying, I got everything up to postcard number 420. And then you realize that his postcard might get lost. So now what do you do? And the answer is, well, you look at your watch, and if you haven't heard anything for a while, you start sending duplicates until you do get a postcard saying, I got everything up to 420. That's basically how TCP/IP works together as a pair of protocols. There's a few other details like domain names and mapping from domain names into internet addresses and figuring out how to route traffic through the internet, how to do flow control. The analogy there is that if you had a book of 1,000 pages and you cut it up into 2,000 postcards and you handed it to the post office and they delivered all 2,000 postcards on the same day to the same post box, except the post box only holds 200, then 1,800 postcards go on the floor and get lost and blown away. So you have a deal with your friend not to send more than 200 at a time until you've heard that they've been successfully received, and you send another batch. That's flow control, and that's how TCP works. So now you know how the internet works. But these simple analogies are accurate enough in principle that somebody can think a little bit about how this is going to work and what problems are likely to arise. So I pride myself on looking for ways to express these ideas in easily grasped terms, in images that you can hold in your head in order to reason about.
One of the reasons why I sought you out specifically, and this was back in 2010, was when you were giving your speech, your presentation, the conference coordinators wanted to make an announcement beforehand. So you had set up the stage and everything. The conference coordinators came on to the stage, unplugged your laptop, plugged in their laptop, gave their announcement, unplugged their laptop, and walked off. They forgot to plug yours in. And so halfway through your presentation, your laptop died. Now, a lot of people would try to troubleshoot the problem and things like that, which unfortunately, while understandable, actually is a very bad thing for the audience because they're sitting
They get
around.
totally distracted by that.
For 5 minutes waiting around. And you had the presence of mind just to go ahead, acknowledge the problem, and then continue on. And I started, looking where I could see that, this was, this wasn't what you had planned to do. On the other hand, your objective was to communicate, not go through a slide deck.
That's correct.
And so you ad-libbed. It turned out that ad-lib for me was as productive as perhaps maybe the slide decks would have been. If you.
I'm not surprised to hear that.
Now, I've noticed over the years that when I started examining what you were doing and what happened in that scenario, that maybe perhaps what we need to do is to number one, take care of the project management stuff so that you don't have that scenario where you're relying on technology and it fails, but also to re-examine the way we use that technology, not so that we rely on those PowerPoints to do basically data dumps. And so one of the things that you had read this book, you had reviewed this book and
Yes, I remember
vetted
that.
it. You found a typo for mnemonic, which I spelled with a P, and you spelled. No, that's the wrong. That's not the right way of doing that.
I'm an ex-editor, and so typos just leap out at me in ways that are inescapable. But this is a very nice, a slim and easily absorbed volume about how to make effective presentations and how to do them. And my conclusion, frankly, is that in many cases, slides are exactly the wrong thing to do. And so from time to time, I'm known to open my discussion with the observation that power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. And it gets a laugh almost every time, and it's not intended to diss Microsoft. What's important is that people will often, your slides will compete with what you're trying to say. And so people will read the slides instead of listening to you. And so from time to time, I've concluded not to use slides at all, and I tell people I'm not going to because I want them to listen to what I have to say. Another possibility is to use slides that have no text. And I'm not as disciplined as I should be about that. But a text-free slide is simultaneously easier to absorb because you're not using up cognitive energy trying to read the words and figure out what they mean. And if the slide images are complementary to what you have to say, it reinforces what you have to say. So I found that if I'm going to use slides at all, sometimes the right thing to do is to have one thing, one image, maybe even one word as a little reminder, and then let people go back to listening to what you have to say.
Now, in the research that I've been doing into the science of high-stakes presentations, the neuroscientists say that these data dumps, these text-heavy slides, they have no impact, no long-term impact on the brain. In fact, as you had pointed out, they're distracting.
That's exactly right, yes.
And the military has said basically that, and these are like General Mattis and others have basically said that PowerPoint is dangerous because it gives us the illusion of understanding. And to the point where you've got companies like Amazon where they've banned these presentations in meetings. Your job is communication, and you're at Google, and the chief evangelist of Google. How does Google train its engineers and its executives about communication? What do they tell the people that are the leaders when they go out?
Well, one thing is not to depend over much on slide-based presentations because you'll speak to the slides and not to the people. On the other hand, there are times when diagrams are tremendously useful. I mean, I'm a visual communicator, so the most beneficial exchanges that I experience, frankly, are two people in front of a whiteboard drawing pictures, trying to explain to the other person what's in your head. And then once you get an agreed model, then you can start reasoning together about what the implications of the model are. In fact, I discovered when I was working with Bob Kahn that we would get into disagreements, and they were fairly vigorous disagreements. And after the first couple of cycles of this, we both said, well, that's funny, why are we having this problem? And then we realized that we each had a different visual model of what we were talking about. And since the visual models were not the same, anything the other guy said didn't make any sense. And so we would, as soon as we would experience this conflict, we said, okay, let's first verify that we have the same model of what we're talking about. So we would work through and make sure we had a common model. Then we'd have our disagreement. But at least we knew we were disagreeing in the same conceptual space as opposed to disagreeing because our concepts were different. So I think Google, although it may not be consistent about this, does try to promote effective meetings. And often that means not presenting slide sets. On the other hand, if you want people to feel like they don't have to scribble notes like crazy, in which case they are not actually listening to the presentation, having something for them to take away can be quite useful if it's reinforcing of the message that you're trying to deliver. So we do make use of presentations, and there are times when they make absolutely important sense, like a spreadsheet, for example, which looks like an eye chart, but it may very well be important to see how the numbers lay out. But we're very conscious of the fact that you can overuse these technologies and fail in the mission, which is to get people to have the same concept in their heads.
In your many roles, one of which was you're on the National Board of Science, the National Science Board.
Yes, that's right.
I'm sure a lot of people have presented ideas to you, both scientific ideas, engineering ideas, and
many times,
entrepreneurs,
yes.
I'm sure, love to talk to you. What do you see that they do wrong? What's the common mistakes that they make?
I think the biggest mistake is to drop too quickly into levels of detail that that don't give you enough time to formulate even a general idea of what the subject matter is. And so starting out with simple concepts to try to get the recipient into a mindset, a receptive mindset. Which universe am I talking about here, as opposed to diving deep into at the very beginning? Now, as a recipient of these things, I am known for stopping presentations and driving fairly deep in, asking detailed questions, partly because it's a tactic to figure out whether the person presenting knows what they're talking about. And so when you start asking more detailed questions and you get squishy answers, then you keep going to figure out whether there's any there. And if I can't get any, answers that have some concreteness to them, that suggest somebody has real experience with the problem they're claiming to have solved, that's actually a useful piece of information, in which case, if it's all squishy and there's no hard content, then that conversation usually ends. But I do think that people make the mistake of trying to present more information than they absolutely need to. At ARPA, George Heilmeyer, one of the former directors, had a list of 7 questions that he insisted getting answers to for anyone who was trying to get a proposal funded by ARPA. And I'm not sure I can generate all 7, but it was roughly like, what's the problem that you're trying to solve? Why is it important to solve that problem? What's the new idea that you're bringing that nobody else has to try to solve this problem? Why you, as opposed to somebody else to solve the problem? Why now? And how much is it going to cost, and what difference will it make if we solve the problem? I think I got most of them, but that's a terrific exercise when you're trying to, you can take those kinds of questions and adapt them in some way. Suppose you're in a sales situation, you're trying to convince somebody that they should buy the product or service you have. Well, what difference is it going to make to you? How much is it going to cost? Why this particular product from this company as opposed to somebody else? I mean, think about that for a minute. You want somebody in the end to come to the conclusion that they want to do what you want to do. In one case, it's please buy my product, and something else is it's please support my project. And so these are very simple, I would say, guidelines that get you through a lot of situations where you're trying to convey something that motivates the recipient to want to follow the path that you're arguing for.
Neil deGrasse Tyson had said that, if I'm not misquoting, that science needs better marketing. That we have engineers and scientists that are coming through their training, and they don't have any communication or presentation training, and they unfortunately have role models who they themselves had not had any presentation or communication training. And so we have this scenario where, and I don't know if we're actually getting worse because of that, if we're in a negative kind of a feedback loop where we're getting sloppier and sloppier with our communication in the scientific world. And I wonder sometimes, has this had a negative impact on science's ability to communicate issues like climate change, or for engineers communicating issues like cybersecurity?
So the answer almost certainly is yes. The problem that we run into, first of all, is that which excites the engineers and the scientists may not excite the general public. I mean, some nitty-gritty little thing, or this little piece of the equation, or that particular measurement. Now, there are some cases where the excitement actually works. For example, the detection of gravity waves. Now, that was a big deal, and it was easily explained to people that it was Einstein's theory that such gravity waves would be generated by the collision of black holes. But we had no way of detecting that until somebody spent quite a bit of money, which is the National Science Foundation in this case, on iterating through 3 different designs for gravity wave detection and finally succeeding. So the general public got pretty excited about that because the scientists were excited. Most of the time, though, the implications of what the science implies is harder for the general public to infer on their own. And so that's where the scientists can be very helpful. If they can explain in fairly simple terms what it was that the science had taught them and why it was important. So when you see the correlation between carbon dioxide and percentages in the atmosphere and temperature, you begin to appreciate, especially if you've experienced high temperatures or particularly bad climate dynamics or major storms of one kind, weather events, you begin to appreciate why this might be important to you. Or if you read headlines or see videos of flooding, for example, or hurricanes that blow down half of the island, like in Puerto Rico. So getting scientists to learn how to communicate is important, especially when they have to recognize what's important to the audience that they're talking to may not be the thing that's important to them. We do have some very serious problems, and it's not about communicating technical information at all. It's about gaining the trust of the general public in science. And I'll give you a scenario which illustrates why this turns out to be hard. Let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that you're a noted scientist and you've been studying some particular phenomenon about health. And I come to you, let's say 10 years ago, and I'm worried about this health problem. So I ask you, what's your best advice? How should I defend myself against this problem? And you say to me, you should do X, or some value of X. Now let's imagine that 10 years have gone by. You've been studying this problem for another decade, and I come back to you and I say, well, thank you for that advice you gave me 10 years ago. What is your advice now? You've been studying this for another decade, and you say, well, I had a theory before, and the theory said you should do X, but I have a better measurement now, and I have better understanding, and now my theory says you should do Y for some value of Y. There are 2 kinds of people in the world. The first one will say, thank you for giving me this extra advice, this new advice, and I realize it's different, but you've been studying the problem for a decade. the second person looks at you and says, so you lied to me 10 years ago. And, and you're sitting there saying, no, I gave you the best advice I had. It was based on the best model I had. And now I've accepted a change in my own model. I wasn't clinging to my theory and rejecting the data that I got. I adapted the theory to match the data. And this person will say, not only did you lie to me 10 years ago, but now I don't believe why either, because of the fact that you lied to me 10 years ago. And that's the situation that we find ourselves in many cases, where people are they misunderstand and think that science is absolute truth. You hear scientific evidence that, scientific proof that. Well, a good scientist will tell you that science is about successive approximation of how the real world works. It's successive improvements in models and ability to predict. Confirmation by making measurements, acceptance that a theory might have to be discarded because the evidence of measurement tells you otherwise. There are a lot of people who are very uncomfortable with that. No amount of factual assertion and explaining of the experiment and explaining of the model will overcome some people's rejection on the grounds that they just don't want to believe that that this new theory is better than the old one. They wanted science to be absolute and unchanging. That's a very difficult cohort to deal with.
So this issue of trust is impacting not only the scientific world, but also engineering and how we trust the information that we get on the internet and how we trust devices that are connected to the internet. And that trust, while we want to be able to trust like our scientists, now we're getting emails that we have to have a little level of distrust because we don't know whether or not this is a phishing attempt or something like that. And so now we're in a situation where before we were not trusting enough and now we're maybe trusting too much. The internet has enabled, while it's been a huge boon to the world's economy, it also has presented some threats. And in the world specifically we're talking about is cybersecurity. How would you explain the threat of cybersecurity to someone who's a layperson?
So, first of all, analogies sometimes help. They often get you in trouble, but let's use one in this case. Think about what we do for young people who want to get driver's licenses. We don't just give them the keys to the car. We tell them, you got to go to school, you have to take a class. We want you to understand the consequences of bad driving behavior. We want you to understand how to be safe on the road. We want you to understand you have to take a test to demonstrate that you understand what the law is and what good practices are before you get out on the road driving this vehicle. And so we almost need a similar kind of thing when it comes to using the internet. We'll call it digital literacy, if you like. And I'm not arguing for an internet driver's license exactly. But what I am arguing is that people should be aware of what risks there are when you're in an online environment. Some of the risks have nothing to do with your own behavior. The software may have bugs in it. The bugs may be exploited. People should understand that that's a risk factor, that your machine may have software in it which is not working correctly or has been, a vulnerability has been exploited by someone. And you have to be not only prepared to discover that, but also be prepared to learn how to discover that. So we're back to what kinds of things do you need to have learned in order to be digitally literate. Then there's a second order thing, which is the content that you encounter on the internet. And because I would say the mantra of the internet in most countries, not necessarily all, is openness, freedom of expression, massive opportunity to find out all kinds of information, some of it not very good and some of it very good. This benefit that we get, this massive amount of potential information, comes with a responsibility. And that responsibility is to ask questions that we would typically call critical thinking. Where did the information come from? Is there any corroborating evidence? Am I being persuaded to do something I don't want to do, or to buy something I don't want to buy? what's the framework in which the information that I'm getting off the net comes in. That's called critical thinking. And I think that we should be training people to use that technique, which is very similar to the way the scientific method works, in order to decide whether to accept or reject content that they encounter on the net. So the biggest challenges we have are people who naively accept whatever shows up on the net and believe it because it was on the net. That's not a good conclusion. Or worse, there are people who deliberately put misinformation or disinformation on the net for whatever political or pecuniary purpose they might have. And we have to become more suspicious of content now than ever before because there's so many different sources of it. We can't even use crowdsourcing necessarily as a way of deciding this is legitimate information and this is not, because unfortunately the bugs that we know about allow people to build botnets that can pretend to be people. And the software that we use to figure out whether it's a person or a program on the other end of the net is not necessarily very adequate. They're called CAPTCHAs, and I think it's CAP, well anyway. So the important thing there is that it's a test that you present either to a human or a computer pretending to be a human to see whether it's human or not. And if you fail the test, it means that we've failed to distinguish a computer from a human being.
Right.
And
Turing test.
Well, the Turing test was a human being asking questions of a computer and a human. Turing test 2, which we'll make up right here on the spot, is a computer trying to interrogate a human and a computer to figure out which one is the computer and which is the human. And if the computer that's doing that fails in the test and it accepts another computer as a human, then it's a problem. So I mean, this is one of the challenges that we have, is that algorithmic solutions to these problems may fail thanks to the presence of botnets and things that can pretend to be human and create statistics that look like everybody agrees with this, even though it's one person and 10 million robots that agree with this, except that the software that we use doesn't know the difference between 10 million bots and 10 million people.
When you deal with family, how do you persuade them to change their behavior when they're using connected devices?
So 2 things. First of all, I think it's vital to explain how bad things could happen because of choices that they make. So they have to have a visceral appreciation for what happens if you click on a phishing message, for example, and you deliver your credentials to the wrong party. And so somebody can now pretend to be you. That can be pretty damaging, especially if they pretend to be you at the bank and your bank account gets emptied, or they get access to your Amazon account and they buy a whole bunch of stuff that you didn't authorize, spending your money on it. So giving them credible scenarios about risk and then explaining things you can do in order to mitigate the risk is the approach I've always taken. For example, at Google, we have chosen to insist that everybody have a 2-factor authentication capability. In many cases, that manifests as a little piece of hardware that has a cryptographic chipset in it. And the idea is that you can be strongly authenticated to the Google system, which is expecting you to have the 2nd factor. If somebody gets your username and password, for example, but doesn't have the physical 2nd factor, which generates another cryptographic password, then they can't break into your account because the Google system says, I need both. I'm okay with your username and password, but I need a cryptographically generated response. So I feel very strongly that strong authentication is essential. It's not that you have to strongly authenticate yourself to the net or to some application every time you use it, because in some cases it doesn't matter. If you're doing a Google search, it doesn't matter who you are. The only reason you might want to log in to do a Google search is if you want Google to help you personalize the answer based on what its experience with your previous responses to searches and clicking on whichever thing you're interested in. So we don't have to force people to identify themselves all the time. But if you want to make sure that nobody else can identify themselves as you, for example, it's a financial transaction, you're borrowing $50,000, and I want to know, how do I find you again, and are you a person? Then I can demand that you authenticate yourself strongly to my satisfaction. You could say no, in which case I will say, fine, I won't loan you any money either. So this idea of strong authentication is central to one kind of protection against certain kinds of attack. The second thing is that you shouldn't believe everything you see on the net or hear. That's true in all media. That's true of radio, television, newspapers, magazines, your friends, and your parents. Seriously. And so, again, it's a matter of thinking critically about the content that you're encountering, regardless of whether it's on the net or someplace else. People need to get into the habit of doing that because it's a kind of dues-paying opportunity. The freedom you have to find information on the net comes with a price, and that price is being attentive to the quality of the content. There's no perfection here. There's no guarantee. But the fact that you recognize potential hazards because they've been explained to you, and more important, that you've been given examples of how to respond. How do I detect that this is a phishing attack? How do I insist on strong authentication if I'm going to do contracts with somebody across the net? I have to give you tools to protect yourself. If all I do is tell you, it's a scary world out there and bad things will happen, that's not helpful. What's helpful is knowing what should you do about it, and what companies should you look to, or what features of their services should you expect or insist on in order to protect your privacy, safety, and reliability.
The internet, this idea of transporting ones and zeros between a network of computers, was a multi-trillion-dollar idea.
Yes.
What's the next opportunity that you see coming down the pike? Or threat,
Okay.
either one,
Well,
or both.
Several things. There are trends right now that are worthy of consideration. The first one is increased and improved access to the internet in general, and that's satellite-based systems are the biggest new idea. Huge numbers of satellites in low Earth orbit. That may make it possible to reach the internet from anywhere on the surface of the Earth, which would be really cool. So that's one thing. The second thing that's happening is an avalanche of programmable devices, which we call the Internet of Things. There are great risks associated with this because if the software has bugs, those devices will be exploited, turned into botnets, and turned into either spam generators or denial of service attack generators, or they will pretend to be people and log into accounts and distort the wisdom of crowds can become very distorted by botnets. So that's a big issue to be dealt with. Looking further out, among the things that have been most important in the last decade is the invention of the smartphone, thanks to Steve Jobs and others. So why is this important? Well, those devices have a whole load of sensory systems on them. Accelerometers, multiple cameras, microphones, speakers, touch-sensitive screens, and just an incredible array of technology. Those devices can be repurposed as medical sensors. And so we're seeing a variety of potential devices, uses or applications of these mobile phones, either to pick up information from other sensors that you might be wearing or even embedded in your body, or themselves to be the source of information. So in fact, there's one example where one of our employees figured out that the sound that you make when you're speaking carries with it some clues about the state of health of your lungs. And if you just suppress the voice content and listen to the noise, you actually will get a good estimate of how good the person's lung capacity is, among other things. So medical sensing is going to be huge, especially with devices that everybody is carrying. So the idea of being continuously monitored is very important from the health point of view, because most of the time people only go into the doctor when they're sick. So the doctor's medical record shows you're sick all the time because you only show up when you're sick. So what we need is to see what people look like statistically in a way that lets us establish a baseline of metrics of health, and then we can detect when that baseline has been exceeded one way or another. That's great for early warning. We may actually see something happening that we would not normally have detected, and that we might catch a cancer, for example, that's just beginning to grow and be able to take care of that as soon as possible, as opposed to waiting until stage 4 cancer has all of its symptoms. So I'm a big fan right now of medical instrumentation in the internet environment. I think it will bring healthcare to many billions of people who otherwise don't have any at all. So I'm very excited about that. In terms of safety on the internet, I'm fairly persuaded that we have some wide open opportunities to make hardware reinforce the safety and security and privacy of software, that they can work together hand in hand. Up until now, we've tended to use software alone, and that's not enough. We need hardware reinforced security. Looking further ahead in the 21st century, of course, I'm fully expecting that the interplanetary internet will evolve, that we will create new spacecraft that will go further out into the solar system and become part of the backbone communication system. So that unfolds over the next several decades. And as the other thing, which I believe is going to be quite exciting, is the use of computing. We'll call it computational X for some value of X: computational biology, computational astronomy, computational astrophysics, computational economics. It's using computers to model things and make predictions about them. Quantum computers may turn out to be our friend here. So I'm convinced that computing will become central to a great many disciplines that we normally think of as being quite distinct, simply because the computers have the capacity to emulate, model, and calculate in endless ways the scientific and economic interests that we have. So Google is a heavy user of its own computing resources for exactly that reason.
Well, Dr. Cerf, I wanted to thank you very much for the internet. Thank you for being such a great ambassador and giving your knowledge and expertise and experiences all over the world to audiences. And lastly, for your being such an incredible role model for being the best dressed person in IT 47 years running.
Well, thank you very much for that, Sid. I appreciate it. I have to say the three-piece suit is a fetish by this time. I've been wearing these things for 43 years, ever since I moved to Washington. When my wife said, "You're moving to Washington, you should wear three-piece suits." And she went off and bought three-piece suits at Saks Fifth Avenue at the Stanford Shopping Center. And it's been my mode of dress ever since.
Well, thank you very much.